Nora, her heart as dry as the desert she had chosen, watched her mother-in-law. Fragile and ill, the elderly woman was tied with ropes to a gnarled, lifeless tree trunk under the merciless sun. The inheritance, the villain thought, wouldn't be wasted on expensive medicines. Nature would take care of the rest. A cold smile played on her lips as she walked away, leaving her mother-in-law to the mercy of fate. But from the golden, undulating dunes, an imposing shadow began to take shape. A giant tiger, with eyes reflecting ancestral wisdom, emerged, not as a predator, but as a guardian. With a precise and surprising movement, its sharp claws tore through the ropes binding the elderly woman. A primordial roar, seeming to come from the depths of the earth, echoed through the air. It was not a sound of the hunt, but of warning, of ancient power. Nora, paralyzed by terror, felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The car keys, her only escape, slipped from her trembling fingers, falling onto the scorching sand, lost beneath the merciless sun. The tiger's primordial roar was not just a sound, it was the very voice of the desert, a thunder that echoed in the earth's entrails and in the depths of Nora's soul. Paralyzed, she watched the car keys, her ticket back to civilization, sink into the scorching sand. A silent scream tore at her throat, but no sound escaped. Terror was a tight knot, suffocating her, freezing her in place. Her eyes, once filled with cold calculation, now mirrored an animalistic dread, fixed on the colossal animal that stood a few feet from her mother-in-law. The tiger, with its golden fur streaked with ebony, did not move towards her. Its eyes, a deep, ancient amber, were fixed on the fragile figure of the elderly woman. There was no hunger in its gaze, only an intensity that Nora could not decipher. It was as if the desert, in its millennial wisdom, had sent an emissary to correct an injustice. The sand beneath Nora's feet burned, but the physical pain was a whisper compared to the inferno igniting in her mind. The keys. Without them, she was trapped in the middle of nowhere, under a merciless sun, with a giant predator and a mother-in-law who, by a terrifying miracle, had just been freed. The perfect plan, conceived with such coldness and precision, crumbled in an instant, transforming into a vivid nightmare. A tremor ran through the elderly woman's body. Slowly, with the help of an invisible force, or perhaps the rekindling will to live itself, she began to move. The ropes, once a deadly snare, lay cut in the sand. Her blurred eyes, accustomed to the darkness of illness and despair, now opened to the majestic sight of the tiger. There was no fear in them, only astonished surprise, followed by a spark of something that seemed to be gratitude. Nora, in a flash of desperation, tried to crouch down to search for the keys. The sand, however, seemed to swallow them, and the heat radiating from the ground was almost unbearable. Every grain felt like a burning coal. But what prevented her from moving was not just the pain. It was the tiger's gaze. It did not attack her, but its presence was an insurmountable barrier, a silent warning that any ill-considered movement would be met with the fury of nature. The tiger then did something even more unexpected. With a smooth and deliberate movement, it positioned itself between Nora and her mother-in-law. It was not an aggressive stance, but a protective one. Like a silent guardian, it watched the elderly woman, who now, with difficulty, tried to sit up, leaning against the gnarled trunk. Weakness still dominated her, but freedom was a balm for her soul. Nora felt sweat trickle down her temples, mixing with the dust. Thirst began to scratch at her throat. The car, with its air conditioning and bottles of cold water, seemed an unattainable oasis. The irony was cruel. She had brought her mother-in-law to die of thirst and heat, and now she seemed destined for the same end. The desert, once her silent accomplice, now turned against her, an implacable judge. Her eyes swept the golden immensity, searching for any sign of hope, any landmark that was not the tiger or the unreachable car. Nothing. Only dunes and more dunes, the relentless blue sky, and the sun climbing higher and higher, promising even more infernal heat. The silence, once broken only by the wind, was now filled with a buzzing in her ears, an echo of the tiger's roar and the frantic beating of her own heart. The mother-in-law, in turn, raised her trembling hand towards the tiger. Her dry lips tried to form words, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. The tiger tilted its head slightly, as if it understood her. There was no fear in the elderly woman's eyes, only a strange, almost mystical peace before the wild creature. She had been abandoned to die, and now nature itself seemed to have risen to defend her. Nora, observing the scene, felt a shiver of horror that had nothing to do with cold. It was the feeling that the world had turned upside down. The victim had become protected, and the tormentor, the prey. The inheritance, the money, the luxury. Everything seemed insignificant before the vastness of the desert and the imposing threat that separated her from her only means of escape. The tiger was not just an animal, it was the personification of wild justice, and Nora was now in its court. She needed the keys, she needed to get out of there. But the tiger did not move. Its amber eyes were a beacon of warning, an invisible wall that prevented her from even trying to approach where the keys had fallen. Time stretched, each second a torment under the scorching sun, and the certainty that her fate had irreversibly changed began to settle in her terrified mind. The desert had become her prison, and the tiger her jailer, and the mother-in-law the silent witness to her particular hell. Hell had a name, and it was Nora. Hell had a color, and it was the relentless gold of the sand burning under her feet. Hell had a sound, and it was the heavy silence, broken only by the buzzing in her ears and the frantic beating of her own heart. The keys, her passport to sanity, lay somewhere beneath that furnace of sand, and the tiger, a monument of power and mystery, prevented any attempt at rescue. Every grain of sand felt like a burning coal, and the air she breathed was like a breath from a furnace. Nora's throat was dry, scratchy, and thirst began to manifest not just as discomfort, but as a searing pain. Her eyes, once so calculating, now swept the sand with feverish desperation, searching for the metallic glint that meant freedom. But the desert, in its silent cruelty, seemed to have swallowed the keys whole. It was as if the earth itself conspired against her, protecting the secret of her escape. The tiger, for its part, remained motionless. Its amber eyes, which had once seemed to reflect ancestral wisdom, were now mirrors of relentless vigilance. There was no hatred, no explicit fury, only a cold determination that was more terrifying than any attack. It was not a hungry predator, but a silent judge, and Nora was the defendant in its court. With each passing second, the irony of her situation became more bitter. She, who had come to condemn, now found herself condemned. The mother-in-law, still fragile but with a new spark of life in her eyes, watched Nora. There was no triumph in her gaze, not even resentment, only a stillness that Nora could not decipher. It was the stillness of one who had accepted fate and who now saw justice manifest in a way that defied all human logic. The elderly woman, with a visible effort, managed to lean more comfortably against the trunk, her eyes fixed on the tiger, which seemed to be her only anchor amidst the desolate vastness. Nora tried to move, a desperate impulse to crouch and rummage through the sand, but the heat rising from the ground was unbearable, and the tiger's gaze, an invisible yet insurmountable barrier, held her captive. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to flee, to find the keys, to escape that nightmare. But fear held her trapped, paralyzed, like a salt statue under the scorching sun. Sweat trickled down her face, mixing with dust and forming muddy trails that itched and burned. Time stretched, each minute an eternity. The sun climbed higher and higher, transforming the blue sky into a mantle of fire. Mirages began to dance on the horizon line, distorting the dunes. making them look like waves of an illusory ocean. Nora's mind, already weakened by panic and thirst, began to play tricks on her. She saw the car, her refuge, a few feet away, but knew it was an illusion, a visual torture. A hoarse groan escaped her throat. She tried to speak, perhaps to beg, but the words were lost in a tangle of unintelligible sounds. Her mouth was dry, her tongue swollen. The desert did not hear pleas. The tiger did not understand bargains. The mother-in-law, in her stillness, seemed to be the only one who understood the language of that place, a language of survival and retribution. Suddenly the tiger moved. Not towards Nora, but with a slow, majestic step. It approached the mother-in-law. With a delicate movement of its snout, it touched the elderly woman's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and reverent. The mother-in-law, in response, raised her trembling hand and with her fingertips brushed the animal's soft fur. There was no fear in her touch, only a deep and inexplicable connection, as if she had found an old friend, an unexpected guardian in her darkest moment. This scene, so surreal and intimate, was a blow to Nora. The wild creature, which should have been the personification of danger, was now the incarnation of salvation for her victim, and she, the predator, was being hunted by the desert itself, witnessed by her mother-in-law and the tiger. The inheritance, the money, the perfect plan, everything disintegrated into smoke under the relentless sun. What remained was only the naked truth of her wickedness, exposed and judged by nature. Thirst intensified, transforming into a constant pain. Nora's head throbbed and her peripheral vision began to dim. The heat was draining her strength, her will. She knew she needed to move, needed to find the keys, but the tiger, with its imposing presence, was a wall of flesh and bone, an insurmountable barrier that held her captive. It didn't need to attack. Its mere existence was torture enough. The desert had become a mirror, reflecting her own cruelty back at her. Every sunbeam was a reminder of her murderous intent, every grain of sand a silent witness. And the tiger, the guardian of an ancient wild pact, was there to ensure that justice, however brutal, was served. Nora was trapped not just by the dunes and the heat, but by the web of her own actions, and time was running out under the feline's vigilant gaze. Despair reached a new level. A scream, more a lament than an articulated sound, tore from Nora's throat. She threw herself to the ground, not in search of the keys, but in an act of surrender to pain and panic. The scorching sand burned her skin, but the physical pain was almost a relief compared to the mental torment. Tears, if there had been any moisture in her body to produce them, would have evaporated before touching the ground. She scratched the sand with her nails, no longer searching, but in a blind frenzy, like a cornered animal. The smell of metal, perhaps from the car, perhaps a hallucination, mingled with the scent of dust and sweat. The tiger, hearing Nora's lament, slowly turned its head, its amber eyes fixed on her, and for an instant Nora swore she saw a shadow of something that was neither anger nor indifference, but a kind of cold assessment. It did not move to attack her, but its posture became even more rigid, more imposing. It was as if it were observing the final collapse of its prey, waiting for the moment when nature would do the work for it. The mother-in-law, for her part, closed her eyes for a moment, an almost inaudible sigh escaping her dry lips. There was no satisfaction on her face, only the exhaustion of a journey that seemed to have reached its climax. She had been saved, and now the wheel of fortune turned for her tormentor. Nora, her face buried in the sand, felt the heat penetrate her bones. Her head spun, and the voices in her mind began to mix with the desert's hum. She saw her husband's face, the image of her luxurious home, the pile of money waiting for her. Everything faded, transforming into smoke under the relentless sun. The reality was brutal. She was alone, without water, without escape, and under the gaze of a predator that did not want her dead from hunger but from justice. The final irony, the cruelest of all, was that she, the controller, had lost all control. The desert, the tiger, and the mother-in-law had become the masters of her destiny, and time, her greatest enemy, continued to advance, inexorable, under the fiery sky. Time, relentless and merciless, continued to advance, each second an incandescent needle pricking Nora's skin. The sand, once merely a stage for her cruelty, was now a furnace baking her flesh, sucking the last drop of moisture from her body. She lay prostrate, her face buried in the golden furnace, her breathing ragged and irregular, a torn sound lost in the silent immensity. The scream that had escaped her throat had been the surrender of her last fortress, the voice of despair that had finally found its echo. The voices in her mind, once whispers of panic, were now a deafening chorus, mingling with the persistent buzzing in her ears. Her husband's face, the image of her luxurious home, the pile of money waiting for her. Everything faded, transforming into smoke under the relentless sun. The reality was brutal, a naked truth that crushed her. She was alone, without water, without escape, and under the gaze of a predator that did not want her dead from hunger, but from an ancient, wild justice. The final irony, the cruelest of all, was that she, the controller, had lost all control. The desert, the tiger, and the mother-in-law had become the masters of her destiny. With superhuman effort, Nora managed to lift her head, her neck stiff and sore. Her eyes, red and swollen, swept the sand, but her vision was blurry, distorted by the heat and dehydration. The dunes danced, mirages multiplied, and the car, her only point of salvation, seemed to float on the horizon, unattainable, mocking. The keys, her passport to sanity, lay somewhere beneath that furnace of sand, but the desert, in its silent cruelty, seemed to have swallowed them whole. It was as if the earth itself conspired against her, protecting the secret of her escape. The tiger, a monument of power and mystery, remained motionless. Its amber eyes, which had once seemed to reflect ancestral wisdom, were now mirrors of relentless vigilance. There was no hatred, no explicit fury, only a cold determination that was more terrifying than any attack. It was not a hungry predator, but a silent judge, and Nora was the defendant in its court. With each passing second, the irony of her situation became more bitter. She, who had come to condemn, now found herself condemned. Nora's throat was dry, scratchy, and thirst began to manifest not just as discomfort, but as a searing pain that radiated throughout her body. Every grain of sand felt like a burning coal, and the air she breathed was like a breath from a furnace. She tried to drag herself, a desperate impulse to crouch and rummage through the sand, but the heat rising from the ground was unbearable, and the tiger's gaze, an invisible yet insurmountable barrier, held her captive. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to flee, to find the keys, to escape that nightmare. But fear held her paralyzed, like a salt statue under the scorching sun. Sweat trickled down her face, mixing with dust and forming muddy trails that itched and burned. Time stretched, each minute an eternity. The sun climbed higher and higher, transforming the blue sky into a mantle of fire. Nora's mind, already weakened by panic and thirst, began to play even crueler tricks on her. She saw puddles of water shimmering on the sand, heard the sound of a running stream, smelled the damp earth. But each time she tried to move towards these illusions, the brutal reality of the desert pulled her back. The elderly woman, with a visible effort, managed to lean more comfortably against the trunk, her eyes fixed on the tiger, which seemed to be her only anchor amidst the desolate vastness. There was no triumph in her gaze, not even resentment, only a stillness that Nora could not decipher. It was the stillness of one who had accepted fate, and who now saw justice manifest in a way that defied all human logic. Suddenly, the tiger moved again, not towards Nora, but with a slow, majestic step it approached the mother-in-law. With a delicate movement of its snout, it touched the elderly woman's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and reverent. The mother-in-law, in response, raised her trembling hand and with her fingertips brushed the animal's soft fur. There was no fear in her touch, only a deep and inexplicable connection, as if she had found an old friend, an unexpected guardian in her darkest moment. The puppet, whose strings had been cut, no longer danced. Nora lay sprawled on the sand, an inert body under the sun that seemed more like a furnace with each passing moment. Despair had consumed her last reserves of energy, leaving her at the mercy of an exhaustion that weighed more than the surrounding dunes. Her eyes, once focused on a frantic search, were now half closed, her vision blurred by a red and golden haze that danced in the air. The mirages were no longer just puddles of water. They were her husband's face, distorted in a cruel smile, or the image of her mansion, crumbling into dust under the same sun that consumed her. Thirst, once a searing pain, had transformed into a chilling numbness, a stupor that spread through her veins, promising a silent end. Each breath was an effort, the hot air burning her lungs, and the buzzing in her ears was now a chorus of distant voices, whispering judgments in a language she did not understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable condemnation. The tiger, a spectre of power and patience, remained in its position, a silent guardian of that scene of desolation. Its amber eyes, fixed on Nora, showed neither anger nor hunger, only an ancestral vigilance, awaiting an outcome that seemed inevitable. It did not need to hunt. The desert was doing the work for it, and Nora was the prey disintegrating under nature's relentless gaze. With each second, the feline's shadow seemed to grow, swallowing the little hope that might still reside in the deepest recesses of Nora's mind. The mother-in-law, for her part, remained leaning against the dry trunk, a figure of resilience amidst the cruelty. Her eyes, once brimming with pain, now watched Nora with a stillness that bordered on serenity. There was no triumph, not even the satisfaction of revenge, only the acceptance of a justice that manifested in ways that transcended human understanding. The tiger's touch on her shoulder seemed to have infused her with renewed strength, a connection to the wildness of the desert that Nora could never understand. She was the witness, the survivor, and now the silent judge of her tormentor's collapse. Nora tried to move a finger, a muscle, any part of her body, but the sand seemed to have become part of her, trapping her in a scorching embrace. The keys, her passport to freedom, were there, somewhere just inches away, but the effort to reach them was monumental, unattainable. Her mind, once so calculating, was now a whirlwind of fragments, memories of luxury, of power, of disdain, all colliding and shattering under the weight of reality. The money, the inheritance, everything she had coveted and plotted for now seemed a cruel joke, an empty illusion dissolving into smoke. A hoarse groan escaped her throat, a sound that barely scratched the oppressive silence of the desert. It was the sound of a soul surrendering, not to death, but to the inevitability of its fate. She felt the heat penetrate her bones, dehydration draining every drop of life. Her skin was dry and cracked, her lips swollen, and her tongue, heavy and inert, barely fit in her mouth. Suddenly, a different shadow, denser, colder, fell over Nora. She didn't need to lift her head to know. The tiger had moved. Not an attack, not a roar, but a slow, deliberate step that brought it closer, its presence now overwhelming. Nora felt the animal's warm breath on her face, a smell of earth, of flesh, of primordial savagery. Her eyes opened minimally, and she saw the tiger's snout, so close she could distinguish every hair, every vibration. The animal did not touch her. It merely observed her, its amber eyes now reflecting Nora's distorted and pathetic image, a woman broken by the very desert she had underestimated. It was an inspection, a silent verdict. The tiger was not an executioner, it was a mirror, reflecting Nora's cruelty back at her, amplified by the relentless vastness of the desert. The mother-in-law, seeing the scene, closed her eyes again, a deep sigh escaping her lips. Perhaps it was a sigh of relief, perhaps of pain, or perhaps just the acceptance that the scales of justice had finally balanced. The desert, the tiger, and the old woman, all together, formed an implacable tribunal, and Nora was the defendant, condemned not by a human judge, but by nature itself. Time stretched, each second an eternity of torment. The sun continued its inexorable march, and the tiger's shadow, though close, offered no relief from the heat. Nora felt the sand under her nails, the smell of metal that seemed to come from nowhere or everywhere. The keys were there, she knew they were, but the strength to reach them had vanished, replaced by a paralysis that held her more firmly than any rope. She was a salt statue, slowly melting under the feline's vigilant gaze, while the desert whispered her epitaph in hot, dry winds. The last vestige of control had disappeared, and Nora, the controller, was now controlled by the landscape, by the predator, and by the consequences of her own wickedness. The tiger's breath, warm and dense, enveloped Nora's face like a shroud. It was not the scent of fresh prey, but an earthy, wild aroma, the primordial essence of a predator that inhabited the desert's depths. Each exhalation was a visceral reminder of the death that stalked her, not by attack, but by patient, relentless vigilance. The amber eyes, once distant, were now two miniature suns, reflecting her own distorted and pathetic image, a broken woman on the brink of the abyss. Nora could no longer distinguish what was real. The buzzing in her ears transformed into a chorus of voices, whispering accusations in an ancient, incomprehensible tongue, yet whose tone was unequivocally one of condemnation. The surrounding dunes rose and fell, no longer static landscapes, but giant waves of a sea of sand, ready to swallow her. The car, her metallic air-conditioned sanctuary, now seemed a metallic monster, its dark windows like empty eyes, watching her with the same contempt she had shown her mother-in-law. Thirst was a fire consuming her insides, drying every drop of moisture, transforming her throat into a miniature desert. Memories of fresh water, of ice cubes clinking in crystal glasses, were exquisite tortures, mental mirages that dissolved into dust before she could reach them. Her fingers, once so agile at counting piles of money, were now inert, buried in the scorching sand, unable to respond to the command of her dying brain. The tiger, with an almost imperceptible movement, lowered its head a little further, and Nora felt the tip of its snout lightly brush the sand a few inches from her face. It was not an aggressive touch, but a proximity that paralyzed her, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. It was as if the animal were inspecting its prey, not for a meal, but for the confirmation of a destiny already sealed. It was the guardian of the scales, the executor of a wild justice that knew no appeals. The mother-in-law, still leaning against the dry trunk, observed the scene with a disturbing stillness. The ropes had been cut, but weakness and exhaustion held her to the trunk, a figure of dignity amidst the desolation. Her eyes, once filled with pain and supplication, now carried a glimmer of understanding, of acceptance. There was no triumph in her gaze, not even the satisfaction of revenge, only the realization that the desert, in its relentless vastness, had taken it upon itself to balance the accounts. The tiger's touch on her shoulder, an act of liberation and power, had infused her with a serenity that Nora could never comprehend. She was the witness, the survivor, and now the silent judge of her tormentor's final collapse. Nora tried to scream again, but only a dry hiss escaped her cracked lips. The image of her husband, once a safe harbor in her mind, now distorted into a malevolent smile, his eyes empty like those of the car. The mansion, the money, the inheritance, everything disintegrated into a red and golden haze, carried away by the desert's hot winds. Luxury, power, the envy that had driven her, everything seemed a cruel joke, an empty illusion, dissolving into smoke under the relentless sun. Suddenly, a gust of wind stirred the sand, and for an instant, Nora swore she saw a metallic glint a few inches from her finger. The keys. They were there, so close, and yet so infinitely distant. The effort to move a single muscle was monumental, unattainable. The sand seemed to have solidified around her, trapping her in a scorching embrace. It was as if the desert itself was laughing at her, showing her salvation, but denying her the strength to reach it. The tiger, as if sensing her last spark of hope, let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated in the air and made the sand tremble. It was not a hunting roar, but a warning, a declaration of dominance. Nora felt the smell of earth and moss, the warmth of its breath again on her face. Her eyes closed, not in surrender, but in a despair so profound that physical pain became a mere whisper. She was at its mercy, a puppet whose strings had been cut, dancing a last pathetic dance under the scorching sun, while the desert whispered her epitaph in hot, dry winds. Time stretched, each second an eternity of torment, and the tiger's shadow, though close, offered no relief from the heat, only the promise of an end she herself had engineered. The end Nora had engineered for someone else now unfolded before her blurred eyes, a cruel and personal spectacle. The promise of an end was not an empty threat, but a certainty that had infiltrated every fiber of her being, more real than the distant glint of the keys. The desert, with its merciless vastness, was not just a backdrop. It was the executioner, and time, its instrument of torture. Each beat of her dying heart echoed like a funeral drum, marking the rhythm of her slow disintegration. The sand under her nails, once an irritation, now seemed to suck her very essence, an invisible quicksand pulling her down into oblivion. The smell of metal, which she had felt before, intensified, mingling with the earthy, wild aroma of the tiger, creating an olfactory symphony of decay and danger. It was the smell of her own ruin, the metal of the key she could not reach, the metal of the car that would not take her away. Nora's mind, once a labyrinth of strategies and cold calculations, was now a battlefield where reality and hallucination waged an all-out war. The dunes danced, transforming into accusing faces, her husband's empty eyes, her mother-in-law's scornful smile, all merging into a formless blur. She tried to focus on the keys, on the promise of escape they represented, but the image distorted, the shining metal transforming into a mirage, an oasis of hope that dissolved into dust before she could touch it. The tiger's breath, once a warm puff, now felt like a furnace, baking her already parched skin. Its amber eyes, fixed on her, were no longer just observers. They were judges, each blink a hammer striking, sealing her fate. Nora felt a sharp pain in her throat, as if thorns were growing inside her, tearing her flesh with every attempt to swallow. Her tongue, swollen and heavy, seemed to have become an anchor, pinning her even more firmly to the scorching ground. The mother-in-law, for her part, remained a figure of disturbing stillness. Her eyes, once brimming with pain, now carried a glimmer of understanding, of acceptance. There was no triumph in her gaze, not even the satisfaction of revenge, only the realization that the desert, in its relentless vastness, had taken it upon itself to balance the accounts. She was the witness, the survivor, and now the silent judge of her tormentor's final collapse. The tiger's touch on her shoulder, an act of liberation and power, had infused her with a serenity that Nora could never comprehend. It was the serenity of vindicated innocence, of wild justice that did not bend to human trickery. Nora, in her delirium, saw the image of her mansion, the luxury she so coveted, disintegrate into a red and golden haze, carried away by the desert's hot winds. The money, the inheritance, everything she had plotted to possess, now seemed a cruel joke, an empty illusion, dissolving into smoke under the relentless sun. The envy that had driven her, the cruelty that had defined her, everything turned against her, amplified by the desert's implacable vastness. A spasm ran through her body, a last desperate effort to reach salvation. Her fingers twitched, scratching the sand, but the movement was weak, ineffective. The keys, so close, so infinitely distant, shone like a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. It was as if the desert itself was laughing at her, showing her salvation, but denying her the strength to reach it. The sand seemed to have solidified around her, trapping her in a scorching embrace, an improvised tomb under the relentless blue sky. Time stretched, each second an eternity of torment, and the tiger's shadow, though close, offered no relief from the heat, only the promise of an end she herself had engineered. The sight of her car, once a symbol of power and freedom, was now a metallic sarcophagus, its dark windows reflecting the sun like empty eyes, watching her with the same contempt she had shown her mother-in-law. Thirst was a fire consuming her insides, drying every drop of moisture, transforming her throat into a miniature desert. Memories of fresh water, of ice cubes clinking in crystal glasses, were exquisite tortures, mental mirages that dissolved into dust before she could reach them. Nora felt the ground spin beneath her, the sky and sand merging in a whirlwind of hot colors. The buzzing in her ears transformed into a chorus of voices, whispering accusations in an ancient, incomprehensible tongue, yet whose tone was unequivocally one of condemnation. The surrounding dunes rose and fell, no longer static landscapes, but giant waves of a sea of sand, ready to swallow her. The tiger, with an almost imperceptible movement, lowered its head a little further, and Nora felt the tip of its snout lightly brush the sand a few inches from her face. It was not an aggressive touch, but a proximity that paralyzed her, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. It was as if the animal were inspecting its prey, not for a meal, but for the confirmation of a destiny already sealed. It was the guardian of the scales, the executor of a wild justice that knew no appeals, and Nora the condemned felt the weight of its final verdict. The tiger's snout, a hand's breadth from her face, was not an aggressive touch, but the final declaration of a verdict. It was the full stop to a sentence Nora had written with her own greed and cruelty. Her breath hitched, a dry, harsh rasp that seemed to tear at her already raw throat. The desert air, thick with the smell of hot sand and the primal musk of the beast, became a suffocating blanket, heavy and inescapable. The keys, they shimmered, a cruel mirage of salvation, inches from her fingers. Her digits, gnarled and sand-caked, twitched spasmodically, a pathetic dance of desperation. Every grain of sand felt like a shard of glass, every movement an excruciating agony. The metallic glint, a beacon of what she had lost, mocked her with its unattainable promise. It was a torture more exquisite than any physical pain, the sight of freedom so near and yet so impossible to grasp. The desert itself seemed to conspire against her. The sand, once merely a surface, now felt like a living entity, pulling her down, absorbing her strength, her very will to survive. The heat was no longer just external. It had permeated her bones, her blood, burning her from the inside out. Her vision blurred, the dunes around her shifting, melting into grotesque forms, whispering accusations on the wind. The sun, a malevolent eye in the vast blue, punished with relentless fury, stripping her of the last vestiges of humanity. The tiger remained, a silent, majestic sentinel, Its eyes, deep pools of amber, held an ancestral wisdom, a distant understanding of cosmic balance. There was no hatred in those eyes, no hunger, but something far more terrifying, a profound indifference to her suffering, an acknowledgement of her self-imposed fate. It was the personification of the wild, untamed justice she had so brazenly defied. Its presence was a constant, suffocating weight, a reminder that her carefully constructed world of luxury and control had crumbled to dust, leaving her exposed and utterly vulnerable. Her mind, a fractured mosaic of fear and regret, replayed snippets of her life. The opulent rooms of her mansion, now faded and distant, seemed to mock her. The glint of jewels, the rustle of silk, the clink of champagne glasses, all dissolved into the harsh reality of sand and thirst. Her husband's face, once a source of security, now appeared distorted, his eyes empty, mirroring the hollowness she felt within. The inheritance, the very prize for which she had sacrificed her soul, was now a meaningless concept, a phantom limb of her ambition. Across the desolate expanse, the mother-in-law remained, a statue of quiet dignity. Her gaze, steady and clear despite her weakness, held no malice, only a profound sense of peace. She was the calm in the storm, the vindicated spirit watching the inevitable unraveling of her tormentor. The tiger's touch had not merely freed her physically, it had liberated her spirit, allowing her to witness this raw, elemental justice unfold without a trace of human vengeance. A searing pain struck Nora's temples, a drumming agony that echoed the frantic beat of her heart. Her tongue, swollen and cracked, felt like sandpaper in her mouth. Each breath was a struggle, each swallow an impossibility. Her skin, stretched over her bones, felt like parchment, ready to crack and peel under the relentless sun. The world tilted, spun, and then settled into a shimmering, hazy distortion. She was dissolving, molecule by molecule, into the very desert she had chosen as the stage for her cruelty. The tiger shifted its weight, a ripple of muscle beneath its striped hide. The sound, a low growl, vibrated through the sand, through Nora's very bones. It was not a growl of imminent attack, but a sound of profound power, a confirmation of its absolute authority in this domain. Nora's eyes, slits against the glare, flickered from the tiger to the keys and back. The distance seemed infinite, the gap between life and death. Her body screamed for release, for unconsciousness, but her mind, stubbornly clinging to the last threads of hope, refused to fully yield. There was no escape. The car, a metallic tomb, offered no solace. The keys, a cruel joke. The desert, an infinite and unforgiving expanse. Nora was trapped, not just by the sand or the beast, but by the consequences of her own actions. The silence, broken only by the wind and the distant cry of a hawk, was deafening, filled with nature's unspoken verdict. She had sought to control life, to manipulate destiny, and now destiny, in the form of a magnificent predator and an indifferent desert, was reclaiming its dominion. The tiger's gaze never wavered. It was a patient look, the look of an ancient hunter who knew that time was just another tool in its arsenal. Nora, reduced to a trembling husk, understood. Her end would not be a sudden, merciful blow, but a slow, agonizing descent, orchestrated by the very forces she had dared to defy. The tiger's shadow, long and dark, stretched over her, a shroud woven by the desert's relentless will. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful and cruel backdrop for her last, desperate moments. The sun, now a glowing disk, dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with brushstrokes of fire and blood. But for Nora, that beauty was just another torture, a vivid reminder of time slipping away, relentless through her fingers. Her eyes, once filled with greed and cruelty, were now just dry slits, barely able to register the dance of colors that announced the end of the day and perhaps her own. The sand, which had burned her during the day, now began to absorb the heat, promising a night chill that would be as cruel as the scorching sun. But the cold was a distant concern, thirst that was a living entity in her body, a hungry creature gnawing at her insides, transforming her throat into a parched abyss. Each breath was an excruciating effort, the dry air rasping her vocal cords, producing only a hoarse, pathetic wheeze. The keys. They were still there, inches from her grasp, a silver glint in the golden sand, an empty promise, a sarcasm of fate. Her fingers, once agile at counting notes and flipping through jewelry catalogues, were now inert claws. Unable to move with the necessary precision, the sand seemed to have become an invisible cement, holding her, denying her even the dignity of a last effort. The tiger. It remained, a striped sphinx, its shadow lengthening and distorting with the setting sun. There was no haste in its movements, only a majestic patience. Its eyes, once amber, now seemed to absorb the growing darkness, becoming deep pools of mystery and judgment. It was not an ordinary predator, hungry for flesh. It was the guardian, the observer, the personification of the wild justice Nora had so arrogantly ignored. Its presence did not promise a quick end, but a relentless witness to her slow disintegration. Nora's mind, already a patchwork of delusions, began to conjure even more vivid images. The mansion, once the trophy of her ambition, was now a sandcastle, crumbling under the wind. The voices, once whispers of condemnation, were now screams, the chorus of all her victims, real and imaginary, echoing in the vastness of the desert. She saw her husband's face, not with the anger she expected, but with a deep sadness, a disappointment that hurt her more than any accusation. On the other side, the mother-in-law, a small but imposing figure against the backdrop of the sunset. Her gaze, once veiled by illness, was now clear, serene. There was no triumph, no revenge, only a quiet acceptance of the unfolding events. She was living proof that life, even on the brink of death, could find peace, while Nora, surrounded by her own greed, found only torment. The liberation from the trunk had not been merely physical for the old woman, but spiritual. A rebirth under the predator's gaze. Nora tried to move again, a final spasm of will. Her muscles, already exhausted, refused to obey. A groan escaped her cracked lips, a sound of pure agony and helplessness. The smell of hot earth and the tiger's musk were the only perfumes left in her world, a constant reminder of her insignificance before untamed nature. The sun touched the horizon line, and the desert, for a brief moment, exploded in a symphony of colors. Vibrant oranges, deep purples, incandescent reds. It was a breathtaking spectacle, but Nora had no breath to take. She only saw the darkness approaching, not just the darkness of night, but the final darkness. The tiger, with a slow and deliberate movement, lay down on the sand, a few feet from her. Its eyes, still fixed on her, seemed to glow in the growing dimness. There was no active threat, but the promise of uninterrupted vigilance. It was the sentinel of her purgatory, the judge presiding over her slow sentence. The temperature began to drop rapidly, and a shiver ran through Nora's body, not just from the approaching cold, but from the terror that consumed her. Thirst, however, did not diminish. On the contrary, it seemed to intensify with the falling night, an internal fire that refused to extinguish. She felt the sand under her body, once warm and comforting, now cold and damp, pulling her down as if the desert itself was claiming her. Memories of fresh water, of a cold glass in her hand, were now vivid hallucinations, exquisite tortures. She saw the water flowing, felt the coolness in her throat, only to awaken to the harsh reality of her dry, cracked mouth. Every drop of moisture in her body seemed to evaporate, sucked away by the dry air and the residual heat of the sand. The silence of the desert night began to settle, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote, a sound that seemed to mock her misery. The wind, once a warm breath, was now a cold whisper, carrying with it grains of sand that whipped her face, each like a tiny needle. Nora closed her eyes, not in search of sleep, but in a despair so profound that unconsciousness seemed the only escape. But her mind stubbornly refused to yield. She was trapped in her own particular hell, a stage of sand and stars, with the tiger as her only audience, and the mother-in-law as the silent witness to her fall. The keys. They still shimmered, a last point of light in her blurry field of vision. But now, they seemed to sink slightly into the sand, as if the desert were swallowing them, denying her even the illusion of hope. It was as if the earth itself was conspiring, sealing her fate, one grain of sand at a time. The tiger let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated in the air and made Nora's last threads of hope disintegrate. It was not a sound of the hunt, but of finality, of a verdict pronounced. She was at its mercy, not of a hungry animal, but of a greater force, a primordial justice that could not be bribed or deceived. Night advanced, and with it the certainty that dawn, if she saw it, would bring only more torment. Luxury, inheritance, power, everything crumbled to dust, carried away by the desert wind, leaving behind only a broken woman on the brink of annihilation, with the keys to her salvation inches away, and a majestic tiger as her final guardian. The tiger's growl, not a harbinger of attack but a seal of finality, resonated through the sand and directly into Nora's bones. It was the sound of a verdict pronounced, irrevocable and absolute. The keys, already a mocking point of light, now seemed to sink even deeper into the sand, as if the earth itself, a silent accomplice to the desert's justice, was swallowing them, denying her even the illusion of a last hope. Every grain of sand that covered them was a nail in the coffin of her escape. Night, once a promise of relief from the scorching sun, revealed itself as a new torture. The cold, insidious and penetrating, began to seep into her limbs, already numb from dehydration. Her muscles, once rigid with tension, now trembled uncontrollably, painful spasms running through her exhausted body. The air, which had previously burned her lungs, now froze them, each breath a cold prickle that scraped her parched throat. The contrast between the internal fire of thirst and the external ice of the night was a symphony of agony. Nora tried to move again, a final spasm of will, a last cry of despair. Her muscles, already exhausted, refused to obey, trapped in painful cramps. A groan escaped her cracked lips, a sound of pure agony and helplessness, a sound that was lost in the relentless silence of the night. The smell of hot earth and the tiger's musk were the only perfumes left in her world, a constant reminder of her insignificance before untamed nature. The temperature continued to drop rapidly, and a shiver ran through Nora's body, not just from the approaching cold, but from the terror that consumed her. Thirst, however, did not diminish. On the contrary, it seemed to intensify with the falling night, an internal fire that refused to extinguish, consuming her from the inside out. She felt the sand under her body, once warm and comforting, now cold and damp, pulling her down, as if the desert itself was claiming her, absorbing her into its vastness. The tiger let out another low growl, a sound that vibrated in the air and made Nora's last threads of hope disintegrate into dust. It was not a sound of the hunt, but of finality, of a verdict pronounced, of a sentence executed. She was at its mercy, not of a hungry animal, but of a greater force, a primordial justice that could not be bribed or deceived. Night advanced, and with it the certainty that dawn, if she saw it, would bring only more torment. Luxury, inheritance, power, everything crumbled to dust, carried away by the desert wind. leaving behind only a broken woman on the brink of annihilation with the keys to her salvation inches away, and a majestic tiger as her final guardian. The cold intensified, and Nora felt her toes and fingers begin to lose sensation, a numbness that spread slowly like a cold shroud. The numbness, a cold and insidious thief, crept from her extremities, claiming her toes, then her hands, a slow-motion invasion of her very being. It was as if the desert, in its silent vengeance, was freezing her from the inside out, turning her into a statue of ice and sand. The pain of thirst, however, persisted, a burning bonfire within her, fighting against the cold that enveloped her. It was a cruel battle, fire and ice in a deadly duel within her body, each pulling her towards a different form of annihilation. Her breathing became shallow, each inspiration an excruciating effort, the cold air cutting her already raw throat. She tried to move, a pathetic spasm, but her muscles, now stiff and sore, refused to obey. The uncontrollable tremor that had seized her earlier gave way to a paralyzing rigidity, a grim foreshadowing of an imminent end. The keys, that last remnant of hope, could now barely be discerned in the growing gloom. The sand, patient and relentless, had completed its work, swallowing them whole. There was no longer even the illusion of a gleam, of a metallic ghost. Hope had been buried, sealed under a layer of fine grains, erasing any trace that she had once had the power to escape. It was the end of all possibilities, the annihilation of any vestige of control she might have over her own destiny. The desert was not just killing her. It was erasing her, turning her into nothing, into dust, just like the keys to her salvation. In her feverish mind, the hallucinations became more vivid, more real than reality itself. She not only saw water flowing, but she felt it, the cool liquid trickling down her throat, the momentary relief, only to be brutally ripped back to the dryness of her mouth. Her tongue swollen and rough as sandpaper, the ice mansion disintegrated in her hands, its marble walls melting into rivers of frozen water, the gold dripping like frozen tears. The voices, once whispers of contempt, were now deafening screams, a chorus of condemnation echoing in her mind. Every name she had trampled, every life she had ruined, shouting her name in a final judgment. Her husband's face, once furious, was now empty, emotionless, as if she had never existed for him. Her parents, disappointed, turned away from her, their silhouettes disappearing into the haze. Her friends, laughing, pointed at her, a pathetic and insignificant figure. Luxury, power, inheritance, everything crumbled to dust, carried away by the desert wind, leaving her naked and unprotected before her own misery, a dethroned queen, her kingdom shattered, her throne of sand undone by the wind. And then, the mother-in-law. The figure of the old woman, sitting at a safe distance, was no longer merely serene. She radiated a soft, almost ethereal light, her eyes glowing with an ancestral wisdom that seemed to transcend time and space. She did not look at Nora with hatred or triumph, but with a calm that bordered on compassion, a deep understanding of the inevitability of fate. It was as if the mother-in-law, free from her bonds and her illness, had become the personification of the desert's own justice, a silent witness to her tormentor's fall, and her peace was a mirror of Nora's agony, reflecting the cruelty she had sown and now reaped. The tiger, a few feet away, remained motionless, a majestic shadow in the growing darkness. Its eyes, bright slits of light in the gloom, watched Nora's every spasm, every muffled groan. It was not a hungry predator, but a guardian, a silent judge, its presence a constant reminder that there was no escape. Its low, occasional growl was not a threat of attack, but a seal of finality, a reminder that time was running out, that the verdict had been pronounced and the sentence executed. The night, which seemed eternal, began to surrender. On the eastern horizon, a faint line of grey light began to creep in, a harbinger of dawn. But for Nora, it was not the promise of a new day, but the final revelation of her annihilation. The cold intensified in the twilight, as if the desert were delivering its last and cruelest blow. The air, once merely dry, now seemed to suck the very life from her lungs, each breath a titanic effort. Her body, now an empty husk, trembled uncontrollably, not from cold but from a terminal exhaustion. The last vestiges of strength abandoned her. She tried to move a finger, but her muscles did not respond. The darkness behind her eyelids, once filled with demons, now became a void, a nothingness. The sound of the wind, which had once whispered ancient secrets, now seemed to sing a mournful lullaby, lulling her to an eternal sleep. The grey line on the horizon expanded, tinging the sky with pale shades of purple and orange. Dawn, so dreaded, was here, and with it, the revelation. Nora, the rich and envious Nora, felt one last spasm, one last contraction of her exhausted body. Her eyes, which had struggled to stay open, finally closed. Thirst, cold, pain, everything dissolved into a profound silence. The desert had claimed its prey, and justice, in its most primordial form, had been served. Dawn brought no salvation, but the sight of a broken woman, inert in the sand, a silent testament to nature's implacability and the consequences of human cruelty. The majestic tiger let out a final low roar, not of the hunt, but of a final verdict, a sound that echoed through the dunes, announcing the end. The tiger's roar, not a hunting cry, but a final verdict, echoed through the dunes, sealing Nora's fate. Then, silence. A silence that was not empty but heavy, laden with the memory of what had just been. The pale light of dawn, which had previously only skirted the horizon, now expanded, painting the sky with shades of lavender and gold, revealing the scene in its relentless rawness. Nora's body lay inert in the sand, an empty husk of ambition and cruelty. Her expensive clothes, once symbols of her status, were now just dusty rags, faded and lifeless, like the woman herself who wore them. Her face, once marked by anger and despair, was now serene, a waxen mask, finally free from the torment that consumed her. Her lips, cracked and dry, seemed to whisper a secret that would never be revealed. It was the end of an era, the collapse of an empire built on quicksand. A few feet away, the mother-in-law, once fragile and ill, watched. There was no triumph in her eyes, not the slightest shadow of revenge, only a deep and silent understanding. The desert had delivered its justice, a wild and impersonal justice that distinguished not between rich and poor, between villains and victims, only between life and death. She felt a shiver run down her spine, not of fear, but of an ancestral reverence for nature's indomitable force. The illness that afflicted her seemed to have receded, not cured, but subdued by the magnitude of the moment, by the sheer adrenaline of survival and witnessing. The majestic and imposing tiger did not move. Its eyes, once bright slits in the darkness, now reflected the nascent light of the sun, a liquid amber that seemed to hold the wisdom of 1,000 years. It was not a hungry predator, but a guardian, an executor of a destiny it had helped shape. It remained there, a living statue of power and mystery, watching the older woman, as if awaiting a sign, a permission. The mother-in-law, with an effort that seemed monumental, tried to stand. Her muscles, still sore and stiff from the long night tied up, protested, but the will to live was stronger. She leaned against the dry trunk, the rough wood scratching her skin, and slowly, with a muffled groan, managed to stand. Her legs trembled, but she was free. Free from the ropes, free from Nora's threat, free to face the desert on her own terms. Her gaze swept the sand, searching for the car keys. But the desert, with its relentless patience, had already swallowed them whole. There was no longer even the illusion of a gleam, of a metallic ghost. The hope of a quick escape had been buried, sealed under a layer of fine grains, erasing any trace that she had once had the chance to escape. The irony was cruel. Nora had lost the keys, and now the mother-in-law was also trapped, though in a different way. The sun, now higher, began to warm the sand, but the air was still cold, biting. Thirst, which had once been a torture, was now a constant reality, a reminder of her vulnerability. She was free, yes, but she was still in the middle of nowhere, without water, without food, without means of transport. The vastness of the desert stretched before her, a sea of sand and rocks, as beautiful as it was deadly. The tiger let out a low growl, almost a purr, and took a slow step towards her. The mother-in-law felt no fear. There was something in the animal's eyes, a deep intelligence, an inexplicable connection. It was as if it were inviting her, guiding her. She knew she could not stay there. Nora's body would soon be a meal for the vultures, and she did not want to witness that, nor share the same fate. With an almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting a silent invitation, the mother-in-law began to walk, one step at a time, in a direction that seemed random, but was, somehow, dictated by a primordial intuition. The tiger followed her, maintaining a respectful but constant distance, its presence a protective shadow on the sand. It was no longer a judge, but a guide, an improbable companion on a desperate journey. The desert, which had been the stage for Nora's cruelty and her subsequent fall, now became the setting for a new struggle for survival, a struggle for redemption. The mother-in-law, the woman Nora had tried to erase from existence, now walked towards the dawn, guided by a wild predator, in search of an uncertain future. With each step, she left behind not only the body of her tormentor, but also the shackles of a past of pain and betrayal. The sun climbed higher, gilding the dunes, and the fragile figure of the mother-in-law, closely followed by the majestic tiger, diminished on the horizon, a silhouette against the infinite vastness. The desert had exacted its price, but it had also offered a chance, a new journey. And as the wind swept away Nora's footprints, erasing her from the memory of the sand, the footprints of the mother-in-law and the tiger deepened, marking the beginning of a new and unexpected story of survival and freedom. The sun, now a relentless sphere in the sky, poured its liquid gold over the dunes, transforming the sand into a furnace. Every grain seemed to retain the night's heat and amplify it, creating a shimmering mirage that distorted the horizon. For the mother-in-law, each step was an agony, a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Her muscles, still stiff from forced immobility, burned. The illness, which for a moment seemed to recede before the horror and adrenaline now whispered in her veins, a cruel reminder of her fragility. But the will to live, a stubborn and untamed flame, burned stronger than ever. The tiger, a majestic and silent shadow, followed her. There was no haste in its movements, only a rhythmic and powerful cadence. Its eyes, once liquid amber, were now golden slits that filtered the light, fixed on the stumbling figure before it. It did not touch her, did not rush her, but its presence was an invisible shield, a promise of protection in the hostile vastness. Each time the mother-in-law stumbled, the tiger let out a low, almost imperceptible growl, like encouragement, a reminder that she was not alone. Thirst was a torture. Her mouth was dry, her throat scratched, and her tongue felt like sandpaper against her palate. The hot, dry air sucked moisture from her body, and with each breath, the sensation of dehydration intensified. She looked at the horizon, hoping to see an oasis, a rock that offered shade, any sign of relief. But the desert stretched infinitely, a sea of sand under a cobalt sky. Mirages danced in the distance, shimmering lakes that disappeared upon approach, mocking her hope. Hours dragged on, each longer than the last. The sun climbed to its zenith, punishing the earth with its maximum heat. The mother-in-law felt strength drain from her legs. Her vision began to blur, and the world around her seemed to spin. She knew she was on the verge of collapse. It was then that the tiger, which until then had maintained a respectful distance, approached. It did not push her, nor force her, but stopped in front of her, turning its head slightly, and let out a low roar, almost a call. Its eyes, deep and intelligent, seemed to indicate a direction. With a monumental effort, the mother-in-law followed the tiger's gaze. In the distance, almost imperceptible, was a rock formation, a cluster of dark stones that stood out from the golden monotony. It was not an oasis, but it promised shade, a temporary refuge from the relentless sun. Hope, fragile as a silk thread, rekindled in her chest. She gathered the last drops of her energy and began to walk again, her eyes fixed on the rock, guided by the silent predator. With each step, a thought crystallized in her mind: life. Nora had tried to steal it, to suffocate it, but the desert, in its wild justice, had given her a second chance. The illness was still there, a persistent shadow, but the experience of that night and that dawn had ignited a flame of resilience she didn't know she possessed. She was no longer the fragile, sick woman, but a survivor, forged in the desert's heat, with nature's mark on her soul. As they approached the rocks, the tiger moved ahead, sniffing the air. It moved with surprising agility, circling the base of the formation and stopping in a small crevice, almost a niche, where the shade was densest and the ground slightly cooler. The mother-in-law, exhausted, collapsed onto the sand, leaning against the cool rock. The relief was immediate, a balm for her burned skin and aching muscles. The tiger lay down at a safe distance, but its presence was still comforting. A vigilant guardian. She closed her eyes, allowing exhaustion to claim her for a few minutes. When she opened them again, the tiger was watching her. There was a silent communication between them, an understanding that transcended species barriers. It was not a pet, but a spirit of the desert, a herald of justice and now her unexpected protector. That encounter, Nora's death, her own liberation, everything fit into a larger pattern, a destiny woven by nature's relentless hands. Thirst was still excruciating, but the shade offered a respite. The tiger, as if reading her thoughts, stood up and with a fluid movement disappeared behind a rock. The mother-in-law felt a pang of anxiety, but the trust that had been established between them was stronger. A few minutes later it returned, and in its mouth there was no prey, but a cactus, one of the largest she had ever seen. With its claws it opened it, exposing the moist green pulp. It was not pure water, but it was life. With trembling hands, the mother-in-law took a piece of the succulent pulp. The taste was bitter, but the moisture was a miracle. She chewed slowly, feeling life return to her body. The tiger watched her, and then, as if its mission was accomplished, lay down again, its eyes fixed on the horizon, as if mapping the next step of their journey. The desert had been the stage for her near death, but also the cradle of her rebirth. Nora had sought inheritance, power, and found nothing. The mother-in-law, stripped of everything, found herself, inner strength and a deep connection with wildlife. The journey had not ended, danger still lurked, but she was no longer alone. With the sun beginning its slow descent, painting the sky with hues of fire and blood, the mother-in-law and the tiger prepared for the next phase of their improbable odyssey, a story of survival and redemption written in the desert sands, under the watchful eye of a wild guardian and the promise of an uncertain but free future.